Hi, folks. I'm Steve Kornacki, and welcome to the Merrymeeting, where we'll spend the next hour or so on the Kennebec talking about various points of interest, a little history, geography, navigation, ecology, and perhaps one or two other subjects that escape me right now. But as we go along, if you have any questions at all, just come up alongside the wheelhouse, and between myself and Captain Earl, we should be able to concoct something that sounds reasonably plausible. But if you have a real stumper for us, we're likely to simply declare another senior moment and move on. Okay, let's get started. The source of the Kennebec is Moosehead Lake, about 160 miles north of here. And Moosehead is an impressive body of water that's 40 miles long and 12 miles wide. It's the largest lake in New England that's contained entirely within one state. The river then flows through a vast area of rich timberland and then passes the inland cities of Skowhegan, Waterville, and Augusta. About 7 miles north of here, the Kennebec joins with five other rivers, the Eastern, Abegadasset, Cattons, Muddy, and Androscoggin, to form this large inland freshwater delta known as Merrymeeting Bay. 38% of the freshwater drainage in the state of Maine flows through Merrymeeting Bay. On its way to the lower Kennebec and the Gulf of Maine beyond, all of this freshwater will pass through a narrow opening known as the Chops. Every 12 hours, the flood tide starts to enter the lower Kennebec and begins to hold back the fresh water flowing through the Chops from Merrymeeting Bay. As the tide advances, the flow of fresh water slows, and eventually it is actually forced back upstream. By the time high tide is reached, the water level in Merrymeeting Bay will have risen by 5 feet, and that tidal influence is felt all the way up to Augusta. And during this process, very little salt water actually penetrates into the bay itself. This dynamic changes with the ebb tide when all of the fresh water that is built up in Merrymeeting Bay combines with the tidal flow of the Kennebec to produce currents in the Kennebec of up to 5.5 knots. From this point forward, all the way down to the Gulf of Maine, the water will be brackish, or a mixture of salt and fresh water. And that's why you're not going to see any lobster pots. The lobsters don't like the fresh water, and it's been widely reported that they don't care much for that melted butter either. From here in Bath, it's a 10-mile ice-free navigable channel down to the Gulf of Maine, and the average depth is about 55 feet. The tidal range here in Bath is generally between 6 and 8 feet, depending upon the phase of the moon. And we have diurnal tides, which mean we have 2 highs and 2 low tides each day. Right now we're at high tide, but 6 hours from now, at low tide, the water level in the river would have dropped approximately 7.5 feet. Well, we seem to have the river pretty much to ourselves today, but it was much busier in the past. In 1892, the Lighthouse Board reported that more than 3,000 vessels were entering the Kennebec, and steamboat traffic placed another 232,000 passengers on the river. That sounded the alarm for improved maritime safety, so in 1898, 3 lighthouse stations and a set of range lights were put into operation. Let's go and take a look at a couple of those now. The first one, Doubling Point Lighthouse, will be coming up on the port side on the island of Arousek. And you're probably wondering, where did the name Doubling Point come from? Well, when Captain Earl gets down there, he's going to make a 90-degree turn to the left at Doubling Point. And then about a half mile further along, he'll make a second 90-degree turn to the right on a point on the opposite side of the river, hence the name Doubling Point. So here we are at Doubling Point Lighthouse. All of the lighthouses that were put in place on the lower Kennebec had the same general layout that included the light itself, a keeper's house, a barn or shed, a bell tower, a boathouse, and also a fuel shed. The original lighthouse was built on this embankment a bit downstream from the current location, and as you might imagine, the complaints were immediate that it couldn't be seen from Bath. So, in 1899, the lighthouse was moved to its present location at the end of a long catwalk that extends through the marsh and into the Kennebec River. Many years ago, the Coast Guard decided to get out of the lighthouse business and began to transfer deeds over to various nonprofit organizations under the proviso that they maintained the properties to a certain level and also had them open to the public. So we now have the Friends of Doubling Point Lighthouse as the stewards of this wonderful property. Although the property has been deeded over to the Friends of Doubling Point Lighthouse, the Coast Guard still retains a right-of-way to the tower and is responsible for it to be a functioning navigational aid facility. It was automated in 1988 and comes on at nighttime and in periods of reduced visibility with a light characteristic of a single flashing white light every 4 seconds. Under the stewardship of the Friends, Doubling Point Lighthouse has become a popular attraction for visitors, and you can drive over here to Rousick Island, work your way on down to the lighthouse, park the car, get out, walk around the grounds, and take the walkway out to the lighthouse itself for a splendid view down Fiddler Reach or back upriver to Bath. Before we get too far along, take one more look back at the granite foundation of Doubling Point Light. As mentioned earlier, this is an ice-free navigable channel down to the Gulf of Maine. However, in the spring we get very substantial ice flows coming through here. And about 20 years ago, several of those granite blocks were actually knocked out of position. So, all the Friends had to pony up about 50 grand to bring a barge with a crane on it down the river, lift up that lighthouse and take it away for a while they rebuilt that granite foundation. So now they tell us we're going to get another 100 years out of it, but we're keeping an eye on it and we'll see how it goes. Meanwhile, let's continue to move along. Coming up on the port side is the Fiddler Reach Bell Tower that was constructed in 1914 in response to an incident that occurred 2 years earlier involving the steamship Ransom B. Fuller. At the time, the Fuller was making its way up from Booth Bay Harbor with a full load of passengers in heavy fog and didn't see the lights. It ran aground a short distance past where the bell tower sits today in an area with a lot of rocks, and while no one was injured, it could have been a major maritime disaster had there been an explosion or fire. To improve maritime safety, the bell tower was built in 1914 to alert mariners to the dangers in the area. The bell tower functions much like a grandfather clocks with a system of weights and pulleys inside that would strike the bell every 20 seconds in periods of reduced visibility. The keeper would have to get over there about every 4 or 5 hours to pull the chains up and reset the clock and get more strikes out of it. Incidentally, the bell that you see today is much smaller than the original. The original is on display back at the Maritime Museum. When we get back to the museum and you're walking up the gangplank, take a look at the pier on the left-hand side and you'll see that original bell. So you can walk over there. There's a hank of rope dangling from the clapper. Go ahead, grab it, and give it a few clanks. Go ahead, knock yourselves out. In the late 1960s, the bell was removed and replaced with an automated foghorn that would sound 2 blasts every 20 seconds in periods of reduced visibility, much to the annoyance of the neighbors. So, after about 10 years of the neighbors raising holy hell, The Coast Guard finally relented and did away with the foghorn. So today the Fiddler Reach Bell Tower serves absolutely no function at all other than to simply be there for your viewing pleasure. Coming up on the port side are the Kennebec range lights, where two smaller towers work in conjunction with each other to keep vessels in the middle of the channel as they work their way up the Kennebec. The front tower stands 21 feet tall, and it shows quick white flashes regularly repeated continuously. And while the light is viewable from different angles, it shows much higher intensity when a vessel is proceeding on the range line. The rear tower is 13 feet tall and is set back a little more than 200 feet from the front tower. The light characteristic is an isophase, which shows equal durations of darkness and white light every 6 seconds. Like the front tower, the light is visible from different angles, but shows much more intensity to vessels that are proceeding on the range line. Vessels coming up the river can start to see the lights about 2 miles away in the vicinity of Ram Island. By keeping the two towers in perfect alignment with the rear tower directly in back of the other so that you only see one image, you know that you are in the middle of the channel and in safe water. If you happen to veer off course, you'll see both towers, and you'll know that you'll need to make an adjustment to your course to get back into the middle of the channel. When Doubling Point finally comes into view, you know that it's safe to start your turn to port, zero in on the lighthouse, and make your way on up to Bath or beyond. The Kennebec range lights have been in operation since 1898 and continue to be an important aid to navigation along the Kennebec. In fact, the range lights are the only active set of range lights in all of New England. Let's continue our exploration by going downriver a bit more to a point where we can talk about tidal sawmills. Okay, here we go. We're now at the site where Spinney's tidal sawmill once stood. It was one of several in the area that were absolutely critical to the growth and development of the wooden hull shipbuilding industry along the Kennebec and elsewhere. As timber was floated down the river from the northern woodlands, there was a need to cut it into usable dimensions for the shipyards. Traditional two-man saw pits that were used extensively during colonial times were simply not up to the task. What was needed was water-driven power derived from the ebb and flow of the tides along the Kennebec. Spinney's was ideally suited in this regard, since it sat at the entrance to a large tidal area where a dam could be constructed and the mill placed on top of it. The backwater tidal area had the capacity to store a huge amount of water, so as the tide came in and filled the tidal area, it was impounded and made available for use later on as the tide in the Kennebec receded. The dam was built across the entrance to the tidal area and included a set of hinge gates that would swing open with the force of the incoming tide, and then on the ebb, the flow of the water moved in the other direction and closed them shut, and the water could be impounded. The mill itself sat on top of the dam, and it also had a horizontal water wheel. As the tide continued to ebb, there was an increasing differential between the height of the river and the height of the impounded water in the tidal area, and eventually a point was reached where all of that water that had been built up could be put to productive use. With the water in the tidal area now at a higher level than that of the river, the sluice gates could now be opened, directing powerful jets of water onto the horizontal water wheel, thereby making it spin. Through a spindle and gear mechanism, power could be transmitted from the wheel to the saw blade and timber could be cut. The critical role that the tide mills played in the development of the wooden hull shipbuilding industry cannot be overstated. Back in colonial times, when two men were working in a saw pit, perhaps 12 boards could be produced each day. But now, with water-driven power, that production number jumps to approximately 200 every day. So let's turn our attention elsewhere now. We'll make our turn and start heading back upriver, okay? As we continue to move back up the Kennebec, a couple of you have been asking about the boats drifting along on the other side of the river and what they were fishing for. Well, the scientific name is Marone saxatilis, but we'll simply call them striped bass. The striped bass are anadromous fish that spawn in fresh water but spend most of their lives in salt water. Most of the spawning occurs in the freshwater tributaries of Chesapeake Bay. Every spring, the stripers in the Chesapeake Bay area begin their annual migration up and down the East Coast. They pass by Long Island, round Cape Cod, and enter the Gulf of Maine. The schoolies start to arrive in the Kennebec in early June, followed by the larger fish, but by the end of September, they're all pretty much gone from Maine's waters as they start to migrate south for the winter. Back 100 years ago or so, there were reports of stripers being taken from the Kennebec in the 90 to 100 pound range. But by the 1970s, the fishery was in near total collapse due to heavy pollution of the waters, as well as overfishing, largely by the commercial fishermen in the Chesapeake Bay area. The striped bass fishery here in Maine began to recover in the 1990s as water quality continued to improve as a result of the Clean Water Act of 1972, as well as increased regulations for commercial fishermen up and down the coast. At the same time, there was a growing awareness on the part of sports fishermen as to the fragility of the fishery as they began to embrace a variety of conservation measures. In addition to state regulations governing bag and size limits as well as gear restrictions, we also have some special regulations in effect in the Kennebec watershed from May 1st through June 30th. During this time, fishing is restricted to catch and release only using single-hooked artificial lures, and marine bait, whether it's dead or alive, is prohibited. We now enjoy a very good and improving striped bass fishery here on the Kennebec. This optimism for the future continues to grow now that the striped bass are beginning to spawn in Merrymeeting Bay, making it the only known location in New England. So, if you have an interest in this sort of stuff, you can work your way up to the Kennebec Marina up on the waterfront in Bath, where you'll find a number of guide boats available to take you out for half a day or so for some action on the Kennebec. Give it a shot. We'll now be working our way back up the river, passing through that half-mile stretch of water between the two doubling points known as Fiddler Reach, and there's good reason for that name. The winds in the lower Kennebec blow parallel to the river, so back in the age of sail, ships would be coming up the river making good time with the incoming tide and the wind at their backs. However, when they make their turn to port into Fiddler Reach, the wind comes out of the sails and they find themselves dead in the water and unable to make forward progress. This is when a captain would oftentimes have the longboat lowered into the water, pulled ahead in front of the ship where the anchor and some chain could be loaded, and then have the crew row ahead of the boat and drop it into the water. The crew on board the ship would then turn the capstan and pull the ship forward, little by little. Back in the early days of sail, the story was oftentimes told of a ship that had made its way through this narrow stretch by pulling the ship forward by this laborious method. Upon clearing Doubling Point, the wind returned to fill the sails, and the exuberant sailors rejoiced now that they had good sailing ahead of them on Long Reach. But tragedy struck amid all the excitement when the fiddler went to the bowsprit to play a tune. As the ship jibed, he was knocked overboard and drowned. Hence the name Fiddler Reach that has stuck ever since. As we work our way back up through Fiddler Reach, keep a lookout for the possibility of eagles in the tall stand of trees off to the port side, and you might see some up there perched on the branches as we did this morning. And it looks like we may not have to wait long at all. Just take a peek in the sky up above on the port side, and you'll see a couple of them vying for your attention right now. With a wingspan of 6 to 8 feet, bald eagles are magnificent creatures to behold in full flight. They have a lifespan of about 28 years in the wild and tend to mate for life. Young bald eagles are entirely brown and molt every year as they lose their old feathers and new ones grow in. Finally, when the eagles reach adulthood at about 5 years, that's when they exhibit the bright white head and tail that make them so recognizable. Bald eagles feed primarily on fish, but they're not particularly fussy and will eat anything they catch, including small animals such as rabbits, squirrels, birds, ducks, and so forth. They also eat carrion, or the flesh and remains of dead animals. Eagles can be a real nuisance to other fish-eating birds such as the osprey, particularly when they're returning to their nest with a catch. That's when the eagles will attack the ospreys, forcing them to drop the catch, and then in midair swoop in and retrieve it before it hits the water or the ground. It was exactly this type of behavior that Ben Franklin found so objectionable when the American eagle was declared the emblem of the United States of America. In his mind, the eagle was an ill-mannered bird and a rank coward. Ben's preferred choice, you guessed it, the American turkey. Well, Ben didn't get his way, so I guess we're stuck with the bald eagle after all. The large wide body of water you see off to our port side is Winnegant's Creek, and this was the area where there was the largest concentration of tidal sawmills in the region. As you can see, it's extremely shallow, so we won't be able to get in for a closer look. And while the mills are no longer there, some of the ruins still remain. If you look way down on the right side, you'll see a causeway with some cars passing over it. Beyond that lies a backwater tidal area capable of impounding a tremendous amount of water. Incidentally, the causeway didn't exist back then since it was built in 1930. The original bridge that spanned the opening was built in 1802, and unlike the causeway, its construction permitted the unobstructed movement of water. A large dam was constructed in 1837 on this side of the causeway that extended from one shore to the other. 8 tidal sawmills were constructed on top, and a single large gate controlled the flow of water for all 8 mills. If you visit the area when the tide is unusually low, you can see the ruins of the stone foundations of the 8 mills that were here back then. They remained in operation until 1898 or so, when the wooden shipbuilding industry entered a period of steep decline. This wasn't the only tidal sawmill operation in the area. If you follow the causeway to the left where the tall stand of trees starts on the other shore, and then follow the shoreline around to the other side, you'll come to the entrance to Old Mill Pond. This was another backwater tidal area where 2 sawmills operated before the large 8-mill dam was completed. Once the 8 mills began production, the 2 mills on Old Mill Pond ceased operation. This is the site where the two original sawmills were located on Old Mill Pond. You can get a closer look by visiting www.tidemillinstitute.org, where you will find drone videos offering aerial views of both the sites at Winnegans Creek as well as Old Mill Pond. The small land area between the causeway and Old Mill Pond is surrounded by water and tidal marsh areas, making it an island unto itself. This was the epicenter of tidal sawmill activity on the Kennebec during the Age of Sail, when tremendous numbers of logs were floated downstream and cut into usable stock. It should come as no surprise then that the locals aptly named this place Timber Island. So now as we go along, you'll know why the tide mills at Winnegans Creek were so vitally important to the growth and prosperity of the lower Kennebec. The wooded area with the rocky ledge beyond the green can is known as Hospital Point. Back during the Age of Sail, with ships arriving up the Kennebec to Bath from virtually ports all over the world, there was considerable concern about communicable disease. That's why ships were required to anchor in this spot until medical teams could come on board, inspect the vessel and the crew, and then make a determination as to quarantining. If the ship was cleared, it could move on upriver and proceed on to Bath for anchoring or docking. So now I'm sure all of you are wondering what this stunning white building is coming up on the port side. This is the Thomas G. Plant Memorial Home. Thomas Plant was born in Bath, but moved to Massachusetts as a young man to seek his fortune as a shoe manufacturer, and established his business in 1891 at the age of 32. By 1910, his manufacturing plant in Jamaica Plain employed 5,500 workers and was the largest factory in the United States. He sold his business later that year, along with the patents for his shoe machinery, to the United Shoe Machinery Company for what was said to be a $16 million price tag. So, at the ripe old age of 51, Thomas Plant retired from industry to pursue a variety of personal and philanthropic activities. In 1917, Thomas Plant built this impressive building and donated it to the city of Bath to provide safe, affordable housing to local seniors needing a home and assistance with the activities of daily living. The Plant Memorial Home was sited on 28 pristine acres along the Kennebec with a magnificent view across Longreach to the Doubling Point Lighthouse. For all his generosity and great wealth, Thomas Plant died broke in 1941 as the result of poor investment decisions made along the way. First, there was his investment in Russian imperial bonds just before the Revolution. Then came the Cuban sugar investment just before hurricanes devastated Cuba several years in a row. With other dubious ventures to his credit, Thomas Plant's financial ruin was complete when the markets crashed in 1929. His legacy lives on today at the Thomas G. Plant Memorial Home, where it continues to serve the community as a nonprofit assisted living facility. The stretch of water we're on now is known as Longreach, and it holds a very special place in the maritime history of Maine, since in more than 400 years of shipbuilding here on the coast, it's estimated that more than 5,000 ships were built and launched in the Kennebec, and it's here on Longreach where more of that activity took place than anywhere else along the river. Longreach is 3.5 miles long and 1/2 mile wide. It has a very gentle shoreline on the west bank, making it ideal for building shipways with the preferred gradient of 2.5 to 3 degrees. And then there's about 30 feet of water directly offshore at high tide. Longreach was the most productive wooden hull shipbuilding area anywhere during the Age of Sail, as Bath became known as the City of Ships. Although Maine had achieved its leadership position in the construction of wooden shipbuilding, the times were changing. By the 1880s, it was generally recognized that the future belonged to ships made of steel and powered by steam. However, the Age of Sail had one last hurrah remaining, and that was due to one four-letter word: C-O-A-L, coal. The industrialization of America was advancing at a very rapid rate, and the fuel of choice was coal. In 1883, the railroad line was completed between the West Virginia coal mines and Norfolk. However, there was an inadequate transportation system in place to move the coal from Norfolk to the major ports along the East Coast. This set the stage for the arrival of the so-called great schooners. These were the 4-, 5-, and 6-masted schooners capable of carrying up to 6,000 long tons of coal, and the preeminent producer of the great schooners was Percy and Small, that operated here from 1897 until 1920. Percy and Small built 41 great schooners, 15 of which were 5-masters of the 57 that were produced along the Atlantic and Gulf Coast. When it came to the 6-masters, there were a total of 10 that were built, and Percy and Small built 7 of those. And of course, the pride and joy of the Percy and Small shipyard was the 6-masted Wyoming. With a registered length of 329.5 feet, it was the largest wooden vessel to ever be launched. It was built in 8.5 months in 1909 with 700 tons of white oak, 2,400 tons of yellow pine, and 300 tons of iron. Wyoming continued to carry coal up and down the coast until 1924, when it foundered near Pollock Rip off Cape Cod. All 14 crew members perished. The large white evocation that you see is located pretty much where Wyoming was built. It's perhaps 30 feet or so closer to the road due to wetlands considerations. While the masts that you see are 120 feet high, the masts on the Wyoming were 177 feet high. The evocation only shows the main mast, since if the top masts were added, it would exceed 150 feet, and those annoying red aviation lights would need to be installed and drive everyone crazy. Thankfully, the museum chose not to do that. Let's continue to move along and turn our attention to the modern era of shipbuilding on the Kennebec with Bath Iron Works, or BIW as it's more commonly referred to, coming up next on the port side. BIW has been a fixture in Bath since 1884 and has built over 425 ships, including gunboats, passenger steamers, battleships, luxury yachts, fishing trawlers, freighters, as well as the America's Cup Defender Ranger. But today, BIW specializes in producing the most advanced and formidable surface combatants in the world. Being sandwiched between Washington Street and the river, the shipyard has a small footprint on the waterfront. Space limitations have compelled BIW to master the art of modular shipbuilding while continuing to implement novel techniques and innovative processes. This modular process begins in neighboring Brunswick, where the fabrication of large and complex units takes place, along with the manufacturing of steel, piping, and ventilation components. These parts and components are then delivered to the 1,280-foot assembly building to begin construction of the necessary assemblies and sub-assemblies that will go into the finished product. After that, things start to come together in the ultra hall, where entire keel-to-weather deck, bow, aft, and midsections, weighing up to 4,000 tons, are constructed in controlled climate conditions. Once completed, the sections are rolled out onto the land level transfer facility and joined together. The superstructures are added, and the ships take their final shape. Other innovations at BIW include the large white operational service towers that are stationed alongside the vessels under construction. They permit entry at various intermediate levels and are equipped with tool cribs, offices, lunchrooms, a freight elevator, and other features to keep things close to the job site. When a ship is approximately 85% complete, it's moved onto the floating dry dock for launching. A set of chains anchored in the river pulls the dry dock out to deep water, where pumps fill the voluminous sides of the dock to a point where the ship can float. It's then taken by tug over to one of the outfit piers, where it will spend perhaps another year or more until it's ready for sea trials. There are currently 3 ships tied up on the outfit piers, 1 Zumwalt class and 2 Arleigh Burke class destroyers. Let's look at both classes now. On the first pier is a Zumwalt class destroyer, the USS Lyndon B. Johnson. These ships were designed to move in close to the enemy shoreline without being detected and engage in precision bombardment of terrorist training camps, military bases, and other static land targets. To make the Zumwalt stealthy and difficult to detect by radar, the tumble-home hull was adopted that slopes inward from above the waterline and thereby returning a much less defined radar image. The superstructure contains radar-absorbing materials and encloses the radar domes, masts, and antennas to further reduce the radar image. These design features allow these 610-foot vessels to have the radar signatures of a 50-foot fishing trawler. The Zumwalts are the first U.S. naval surface combatants to feature all-electric propulsion, with gas turbines driving electric generators to produce 78 megawatts of power. Not only is power available to propel the ship, but ample power is also available to meet the heavy demands of radar, sonar, communications, and weapons systems. The turret structures that you see on the front of the hull house the advanced gun systems that fire GPS-guided long-range land attack projectiles up to 80 miles inland. This bombardment capability is augmented by cruise missiles that can be launched against targets at a great distance. The Navy had originally planned to build 32 Zumwalts, but ultimately determined that they could not defend themselves from missile and air attacks. As the production numbers were reduced, economies of scale were lost, and the cost spiraled out of control, forcing the cancellation of the program. The Lyndon B. Johnson was only the 3rd Zumwalt to be built, and it will be the last. Now we come to the venerable Arleigh Burke class destroyers. On the pier closest to us is the USS Daniel Inouye, and in back of it is the USS Carl M. Levin. Both ships will eventually join the other Arleigh Burkes already in service as the backbone of fleet defense for the carrier task forces that are strategically stationed around the globe. The Arleigh Burkes have extraordinary capabilities to detect, track, and destroy any threat, whether it's under the sea, on the surface, or in the air. Such performance is made possible by the Aegis combat system, an advanced command and control and weapon control system that uses powerful computers and radars to track and guide weapons to destroy enemy targets. The premier weapon system is the Mark 41 vertical launching system, capable of firing a variety of missiles in rapid-fire succession against hostile threats. Its capabilities include intercepting ballistic missiles in outer space, destroying aircraft, cruise missiles, and ships at various ranges up to 270 miles, launching Tomahawk cruise missiles at targets up to 1,350 miles away, and firing anti-submarine rockets that carry torpedoes to targets 10 miles away. Additional weapons aboard the Arleigh Burkes include Harpoon anti-ship missiles, rolling airframe missiles for short-range ship defense, phalanx anti-ship missiles, torpedo launchers, and a 127 millimeter gun for surface vessel engagement and shore bombardment. The Arleigh Burkes have been the mainstay of the Navy's surface fleet for more than 30 years and represent the largest production run in the history of the Navy. They began building the class in the late 1980s, are building them today, and will continue to build them until the next generation of surface combatants come along. Meanwhile, the carrier task forces are in good hands with the Arleigh Burkes nearby. This is BIW today, but as we cruise past the older section of the shipyard, let's reflect on the role it played during World War II, when 82 destroyers were built on this site, more than the entire Japanese Navy. This was a hustling and bustling place back then, with 12,000 workers on a 24/7 schedule and ships under construction on 8 shipways. During the high production years of 1943 and 1944, there was a new destroyer being launched into the river every 17 days and sent on its way to join the Tin Can Navy. The destroyers that were built here were revered by the sailors for their ruggedness and survivability, and their exploits were legendary. With the launching of each new destroyer today, BIW continues to build on its proud legacy here in the city of ships, where Bath built is best built. We'll now work our way up to the waterfront in Bath by passing under the 2 bridges ahead of us. The first is the Carleton Bridge that was built in 1927 to provide for railroad traffic across the Kennebec on the bottom deck, while automobile traffic on Route 1 used the upper deck. The bridge has a tower design so that both decks can be raised to provide 135 feet of clearance for vessels to pass underneath. This was an important consideration back when taller ships would be coming up the Kennebec, but the raising and lowering caused major traffic delays for the cars, particularly in the summer when the vacationers arrived. Before the Carleton Bridge came along, everything needed to move across the river on ferries and barges, causing great difficulties. That was particularly true back in 1890, when the Barnum and Bailey Circus came to town. When the show was over and needed to head down the coast, it took 33 trips to move 66 circus railroad cars across the river. Today, the bottom portion of the Carleton Bridge still carries rail traffic, but the auto deck has been cut off and is no longer able to be used. The Sagadahoc Bridge was built in 2000 and carries 4 lanes of Route 1 traffic. It's the longest precast concrete segmental span in North America and the last downstream road crossing of the Kennebec. So here we are in the city of ships, and what a fitting name that is for Bath. In 1855, Maine built 1/3 of the ships built in the country, more than any other state. Bath built 26% of that total and was only rivaled by New York and Boston. Despite Bath's relatively small population, the Custom House was the 5th busiest in the country at the time, only behind New York, Philadelphia, Boston, and Baltimore. It's hard to imagine now, but spread along the waterfront were 22 shipyards with an expansive network of piers and docks. In the town itself were all the requisite support businesses and services necessary for a thriving shipbuilding and commercial center. This included the chandleries, rope makers, marine insurers, commercial fleet operators, financiers, sailmakers, and all the rest. Bath had it all. The yellow building and adjoining Quonset hut on the waterfront are where Maine's first ship project is working to honor Bath's maritime legacy that began in 1607. That's when the Popham colonists landed at the mouth of the Kennebec and went about constructing a fort, as well as a 50-foot pinnace that could be used to explore inland and coastal waters. The pinnace was named the Virginia of Sagadahoc, and it was the first ship the English built in the New World that was capable of crossing the Atlantic. This was the beginning of the long history of shipbuilding on the Kennebec. Now, 400 years later, Maine's first ship volunteers are busy building a replica of the Virginia. The work would have been done by now if COVID-19 hadn't come along. The hope is for Virginia to be in the water by next summer and be able to take visitors out onto the Kennebec for a hands-on and up-close look at maritime history. Bath today continues to thrive as a working coastal community with deep historical roots that's worth a visit in any season. The town is quite walkable and the parking is free. There's no need to search for that parking meter app on your iPhone. A stroll down Front Street will take you back in time before the arrival of the big box stores and the shopping malls. Here you will find brick sidewalks with benches where neighbors meet to catch up on things and shop in a variety of friendly, independently owned stores. Looking for something to eat? No problem here in Bath. Here you will have a number of restaurants and taverns to choose from. Or perhaps you just might want to grab a pint or two in one of the pubs. Library Park is just a block away, with beautiful old sea captain's homes lining Washington Street. And if you'd like to see more of the town than you can do by walking, there's always the Bath Trolley Charlie to get you around, and the fare is still only $1. Down along the river is Waterfront Park, where you'll find a number of informational plaques where you could learn about the history of Bath and the Kennebec. Or you just may want to sit in one of the Adirondack chairs up on the knoll overlooking the river and just simply watch the tide come in and out. There are much worse things that you can do with your time. And of course there's the Kennebec Tavern and Marina, where you can watch the pleasure boats pull up to the dock to refuel and take on passengers, or you just might like to enjoy a leisurely lunch in the outdoor dining area on the deck. Check it out. Whatever you decide to do in Bath, you're very likely to come back, since it has such an authentic and compelling small-town America feel that continues to beckon. You'll see. We're going to depart the Kennebec at this point and take a brief diversion down the Sasanoa River to give you a look at the entrance to the so-called Inside Passage from Bath to the Sheepshead River and Booth Bay Harbor. If you look at the map of Maine starting from Kittery at the New Hampshire border and draw a line to Eastport at the Canadian border, the distance along the coast would be about 230 miles as the crow flies. But if you were to trace the coast along with all the islands, harbors, bays, and estuaries, the actual coastline is nearly 3,500 miles long. Here in the mid-coast area, the coastline is heavily indented and includes the major tidal estuaries, the Kennebec, Sheepshead, and Damariscotta rivers. They extend inland from the coast from 10 to 14 miles and are separated by a variety of peninsulas and interconnected islands. However, the Inside Passage allows vessels to pass from the Kennebec over to the Sheepshead without having to go back down to the Gulf of Maine and thereby avoiding the coastal route. The Sasanoa is the connector that links both river systems. However, it's misleading to call the Sasanoa River since it lacks a flow of fresh water, and it's simply an interconnected network of tidal bodies of water. Many of the areas along the way look very large and expansive, but if you don't follow the green and red navigational aids closely, as we're currently doing, there's a great risk of running aground on the mudflats, or worse yet, the rocks. So we'll make our turn here and head back to the Kennebec. as we pass back through the narrow passage between Arousik and Woolwich. This is a good area to observe ospreys, or seahawks as they're also referred to, so let's keep a sharp lookout. The ospreys feed primarily on fish and fly over the water seeking their prey. When spotted, the ospreys plunge feet first into the water to grab the fish with its talons. After a successful strike, the ospreys head back to the nest with their prey, and with an apparent inbred sense of aerodynamics, they always orient the fish head first into the wind. Ospreys are migratory and are starting to head south now that the weather is getting cooler. When they return next season, they will seek out the same nest they've occupied in prior years and will add additional material. Right now it looks like they may have already left, but they'll be back. You can bet on it. So, it's a great day to be out here on the Kennebec to enjoy the fresh air, fine weather, and outstanding scenery. But you know, things weren't always this way around here. Just 50 years ago, you probably wouldn't want to be out on the water. The stench would be nauseating, there would be very little boating traffic or people fishing, and you certainly wouldn't see any eagles or ospreys. By the 1960s, more than 150 years of abuse had taken its toll. By then, the Kennebec and the Androscoggin were considered to be two of the most polluted rivers in the entire United States, and Merrymeeting Bay had the reputation of being an open sewer. The degradation in water quality began in the early 1800s when dams were constructed to power the mills without providing fishways. As a result, the enormous fish runs that used to occur regularly every year were now a thing of the past. In fact, the last time salmon were seen at the Great Falls in Lewiston was in 1816. Then came the textile, pulp, and paper mills after the Civil War. Collectively, these mills were depositing enormous amounts of toxic material into the rivers year after year. An extreme polluter among them was the Scott Paper Mill in Winslow that dumped as much pollution into the Kennebec every day that would come from the sewage of a city of 2 million people. On top of all that, the tanneries were putting dyes into the river that would change the color of the water. With the expansion of these industries, the towns and cities like Lewiston, Auburn, Augusta, and Waterville began to grow as well, with the sewage going directly into the rivers. The rotting waste and sludge floating on the surface produced hydrogen sulfide gas, you know, that rotten egg smell. The vapors were so nauseating and potent along stretches of the Kennebec that paint was peeling off cars and buildings. When the hydroelectric dams started to come along in the 1930s, the water in large sections of the Androscoggin was impounded. This effectively drowned the river rapids that had naturally provided oxygen in the past. Similar negative impacts on dissolved oxygen levels were taking place in the Kennebec with the log drives that deposited huge amounts of bark into the river. The leaching of the bark depleted large quantities of oxygen that could otherwise be available for aquatic life. Fortunately, things began to change in a big way with the passage of the Clean Water Act of 1972. Under its provisions, funding was made available to municipalities to build and improve wastewater treatment facilities. It also set minimum standards for waste discharges for each industry, as well as regulations for specific problems, such as toxic chemicals and oil spills. The improvements made in water quality since the passage of the Act have truly been remarkable. You can now swim in the water, eat the fish taken from it, and enjoy a wide range of recreational activities. Thanks to a heightened public awareness of environmental issues and the ongoing work of organizations such as the Natural Resource Council of Maine, the Friends of Merrymeeting Bay, and the Kennebec Estuary Land Trust. Life is good on the Kennebec, and getting better each and every year. We're now approaching the museum, so this will conclude the narration as we prepare for docking. Thanks for coming along, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day here at the Maine Maritime Museum, as well as in the City of Ships. Take care.